My name is Leo. I'm 30, from this worn-out wheelchair in a little room at a care facility here in Indiana. I'm going to tell you how my life ended up here. The rain is coming down hard against the window pane, a steady drumbeat for the memories I've spent years trying to silence. But you can never really escape them, can you? Don't picture some tycoon with a fortune stashed away or a sprawling estate full of fancy cars. That's not my story. My only real possessions are the scars that cover my body and have settled deep in my spirit. I'm what you'd call a survivor. To make any sense of it, though, we have to go all the way back. Back to where it all began, in a forgotten corner of Indiana. I was just a kid back then, full of impossible dreams, long before life came and ripped it all to shreds. I grew up in a part of Gary that everyone called the Hollows, a name that promised nothing but hopelessness from the start. It was a tangle of sagging old houses leaning against each other for support, where the permanent scent of motor oil and rot hung in the air. So thick you felt like you were breathing it in with every gulp of air. Our place was a cramped two-bedroom flat where the walls were permanently nicotine yellow and streaked with water stains. Every time a storm rolled through, we'd set out pots and pans to catch the drips, the plink-plonk sound becoming the soundtrack to our nights. My dad, Frank, was a mechanic at a local garage. He'd stumble in late, his hands permanently stained with grease and the sour smell of cheap beer clinging to him like a second skin. My mom, Sarah, spent her days on her feet at a greasy spoon diner, wearing a smile that never quite reached her exhausted eyes, all for the hope of a few extra dollars in tips. Money was more than tight. It was a constant, suffocating absence. Many nights, dinner was nothing more than peanut butter spread thin on stale bread. And I figured out early on that asking for things only brought a fresh wave of pain to my parents' faces. So I learned to keep my wants to myself. But even in a place like that, a boy's imagination can be a powerful thing. It has to be. My favorite escape was the mountain of worn-out tires behind my dad's garage. I'd scramble up the slick black rubber, the whole world smelling of oil and decay, and pretend I was a lone adventurer charting an unknown wilderness. My partner in every adventure was Sam. He was a wiry kid with a shock of untamable red hair and eyes that always seemed to be looking at something far away. He was constantly devouring sci-fi paperbacks from the public library, and his head was full of starships and distant galaxies. He'd grab my arm, his voice low and urgent. "Leo, listen to me. We're not staying here. We're gonna get out of this dump for good, you just watch." And I, a kid who had nothing else, clung to that promise with everything I had. I absolutely believed him. I held onto that dream like a shield, sure that one day I'd be somebody, that I'd do something that mattered. But that fragile hope shattered the year I turned 9. It started on a raw autumn morning. My mom's voice called me to the kitchen, and the sound of it made the hair on my arm stand up. She was standing by the sink in a frayed old cardigan, her hands twisting a dish towel over and over. Her eyes, usually so tired but kind, were darting around the room, unable to land on me. There was a secret in them, a heavy one. "Leo, you're not going to school today," she said, her voice thin like a thread about to snap. "We have to take you for a checkup, to a special place." A knot of confusion tightened in my stomach. "A checkup for what, Mom?" I asked, my voice small. "I feel fine." My father was leaning in the doorway, a dark shape blocking the light. "Just do what you're told and don't ask so many questions," he grumbled. "Get your coat, let's go." His tone shut down any further protest. We crammed into his ancient pickup, a machine I called the Rattler because it felt like every bolt was about to shake loose on the highway. The drive felt endless. We left the Hollows and its familiar smells behind, the city giving way to miles of flat, empty fields under a sky the color of dishwater. After what felt like half a day, we pulled up to a bleak, gray concrete building that seemed to rise out of nowhere, stranded beside the interstate. It had very few windows, looking more like a fortress than any doctor's office I had ever seen. It didn't look like any hospital I'd ever imagined. It was more like a bunker or a forgotten warehouse, stark and windowless. There were no signs, no people milling about. Just a heavy steel door and a handful of nondescript cars in the parking lot. A shiver of pure dread went through me. I reached for my mom's hand, and the icy cold of her skin seemed to travel right up my arm and into my chest. "It's okay, Leo, don't be afraid," she murmured, but her own hand was shaking uncontrollably in mine. The inside was a shock. It was unnervingly sterile, the floors polished to a mirror shine, and the air had a sharp chemical smell that burned my nostrils. A man with thin, steel-framed glasses and a crisp white lab coat came to meet us. His name tag read Dr. Peterson. He offered a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. A predator's smile. "A strong, healthy boy," he commented, giving my shoulder a pat that felt more like an appraisal. "This won't take long. Just a few simple tests and you'll be on your way home." The rest is a blur, a collection of terrifying snapshots. They led me into a room that was blindingly white, from the walls to the floor. They instructed me to lie down on a metal table that was shockingly cold against my back. I felt a sharp sting in my arm, then another, even sharper one in the side of my neck. A wave of grogginess washed over me, thick and suffocating. My eyelids felt like they were made of lead, and then the whole world just dissolved into darkness. The next thing I knew, I was in my own bed. The familiar cracks in the ceiling swam into focus. My head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, and my limbs felt heavy and useless, as if I'd run a marathon in my sleep. My mom was there, sitting on the edge of the mattress, her hand stroking my hair. "You're okay now," she kept saying over and over, but she wouldn't look me in the eye. When I tried to ask what happened, what kind of tests they'd done, the answer was always the same vague dismissal. "It was just a checkup, sweetheart. Don't you worry about it." I tried so hard to accept her words, to push the fear down, but a cold certainty had taken root in my gut. Something was wrong. I felt hollowed out, like a piece of me was missing. It didn't take long for the changes to start. A few weeks after that day, a new kind of pain began, sharp and electric, like tiny needles jabbing deep into my leg muscles. Soon after, my balance started to go. I'd stumble over nothing, my legs giving out from under me without warning. I couldn't run anymore. The simple joy of it was just gone. One afternoon, I tried to scale the tire mountain behind the garage, just like I'd done 1,000 times before. I didn't even make it halfway up before my legs buckled. I fell hard, my knees smashing against the packed dirt, but this time I couldn't push myself back up. My legs wouldn't obey. Sam, seeing the sheer terror on my face, took off sprinting to find my dad. When my father finally came and lifted me into his arms, there was no comfort in his touch, only irritation. "Why can't you just be more careful?" he grumbled, his voice rough. Tears streamed down my face, not from the throbbing in my knees, but from the terrifying, suffocating feeling of being trapped inside my own body. In the months that followed, the numbness spread, creeping up my legs like a slow, cold tide. Soon I couldn't even stand without crutches. It was a doctor at the county hospital who finally gave it a name: lower body paralysis. He called it a rare neurological disorder, his words clinical and distant, but he couldn't give us a reason. No one could explain why it had happened. My parents didn't push for more answers. They didn't take me to specialists or look for any kind of treatment. They just came home one day with a second-hand wheelchair that groaned and squeaked with every tiny movement, a constant reminder of everything I'd lost. At the same time, my body was failing me. A strange and unsettling transformation was happening to my family. The first sign was a brand new car, a sleek dark blue SUV that gleamed in the driveway. It was a world away from the Rattler. Not long after, my parents announced we were moving. A fresh start, my mom called it, forcing a bright smile that looked brittle enough to shatter. We abandoned the hollows and moved to a pristine suburb on the other side of the state, the kind of place with perfect emerald green lawns and tidy white fences. The new house was enormous. It had a fireplace in the living room and a sprawling kitchen with polished granite counters that felt cold to the touch. I was 10 years old, confined to a squeaking wheelchair, and I felt like a stain on their perfect new life. A piece of broken furniture they didn't know where to hide. I remember asking my dad one evening, my voice barely a whisper, "How can we afford all this?" He just gave me a thin, tight smile. "Business has been good, son. Very good. Just don't ask so many questions." That was his real answer. But I wasn't an idiot even then. I saw things. I saw the thick manila envelopes stuffed with cash that my mom would quickly hide away in a dresser drawer. I heard the late-night phone calls, my parents whispering into the receiver in the darkened kitchen. I noticed the long stretches of time when they'd both be gone, offering no explanation for where they went or what they did. My mom started dressing differently, in expensive clothes and delicate gold jewelry. My dad wore a heavy gold watch that flashed whenever he moved his wrist. Their lives were getting shinier, but the way they looked at me grew colder and more distant every day. That flicker of warmth I used to see in their eyes, that simple love, had been extinguished. Now, when they looked at me, it was with a kind of weary impatience, as if I were a constant, unpleasant reminder of a debt they wished they'd never incurred. I tried to make it work. I taught myself how to maneuver my chair through the wide, empty hallways of that sterile house. I even tried to talk to the kids in the neighborhood, but they just stared, their eyes full of a morbid curiosity that made my skin crawl. Sam was gone, a whole world away, and with him, my only real friend. My new school was a landscape of loneliness. The other kids would fall silent when I wheeled past, only to erupt in whispers and snickers as soon as I was out of earshot. I heard them call me the cripple, so I retreated. I found my only escape in the school library, losing myself in stacks of adventure novels. Between the pages of a book, I wasn't the broken boy in the wheelchair. I could be a fearless knight on a quest, a brilliant astronaut exploring new worlds. I could be anyone at all as long as it wasn't me. My parents drifted even further away, becoming like polite, wealthy strangers who happened to live in the same house. They no longer asked about my day or told me stories before bed. Our family dinners turned into long, silent ordeals. I'd be at one end of the massive dining table, pushing food around my plate, while they sat at the other, their voices low as they discussed plans I wasn't part of. Vacations, stock portfolios, social events. One night I heard my mother's voice float out from the living room. "Just a few more years, Frank," she was saying to my father. "Then all of this will finally be over." I had no idea what all of this meant, but the sound of her voice, flat and cold, made a shiver of pure dread crawl up my back. I began to pay closer attention, to notice the small things that didn't add up. One afternoon, looking for a pen in my father's home office, I stumbled upon a thick file folder hidden in a desk drawer. I pulled it out. The pages were filled with official-looking text, dense with words I barely recognized. Clinical trial, informed consent, compensation schedule. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I knew somehow that these papers were about me, but I was too afraid to ask. Every time I had tried to question anything, my parents would either shut me down with a cold look or explode with anger. "Don't you dare meddle in adult business, Leo," my father had roared at me once, his fist slamming down on the kitchen table so hard it sent my water glass crashing to the floor. The message was clear: stay quiet. The year I turned 11, my mother announced she was pregnant. For a fleeting moment, I let myself hope. A new baby. Maybe this was the thing that would pull us back together. I pictured having a little brother, someone I could talk to, someone I could tell stories to. I was so profoundly lonely. But the moment my brother Adam was born, that fragile hope turned to dust. Adam was perfect. He was a beautiful, healthy baby with wide, curious eyes and a gurgling laugh that enchanted everyone who heard it. My parents gazed at him as if he were a miracle, a precious gift, and in the light of their adoration for him, I faded completely, becoming a ghost haunting the hallways of my own home. The shift was swift and brutal. All their time, all their energy, all their love was poured into Adam. His room overflowed with expensive toys. They took him on sunny outings to the park, their camera constantly clicking, capturing every smile, every milestone. I, on the other hand, was usually left behind, confined to my room with my worn-out books and the constant mocking squeak of my wheelchair. I remember once asking my mom why I couldn't go with them to the zoo. She turned to look at me and her expression was flat, her eyes like chips of ice. "Leo," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth, "you would just make things complicated." The words were quiet, but they landed like a physical blow, sharper and more painful than any needle. After that, the whispers grew louder, less hidden. Useless. A burden. A mistake we have to live with. My parents stopped trying to conceal their resentment. It was there in every glance, every sigh. One evening, their voices, sharp and angry, carried from the living room. I wheeled myself closer to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. "If it weren't for him, everything would be so much simpler," my father said, his voice thick with frustration. "We did what we had to do, Frank," my mother shot back, her tone clipped and final. "We can't have regrets." I backed away from the door, my hands trembling on the wheels of my chair. That night, I cried myself to sleep, the silent tears soaking my pillow as I tried to piece together how I had become the thing that was ruining their lives. I didn't understand. I couldn't know that those years of cold shoulders and bitter words were just the prelude to a much darker truth. The secrets they guarded so fiercely. The memory of that white room and the sharp sting of the needles. It was all a time bomb ticking away, waiting for the moment it would detonate and shatter what was left of my world. But at that age, I was just a lonely kid, focused only on surviving the day, completely oblivious to the fact that I had been traded away, my future sold, long before I even knew what it was. When I turned 18, an age that for most people signifies freedom, the start of college, road trips, a life finally beginning, it was just another number to me. It marked one more year spent as an invisible burden in the house I was supposed to call home. From my wheelchair, I'd sit for hours just staring out the window of my room, watching the autumn leaves drift down in the soft Indiana twilight. It was Thanksgiving Day. Downstairs, our showpiece of a house was filled with the smells of roasting turkey and the sounds of my mother orchestrating a feast. But up in my room, a deep chill had settled in my bones. It felt like winter had come just for me, a personal frost that froze any last bit of hope I might have been foolish enough to hold on to. In the years since Adam's birth, I had become an expert at navigating their indifference. My parents, Frank and Sarah, had long ago dropped the pretense of affection. I was their inconvenient truth, the living, breathing evidence of a past they were desperate to erase. I'd heard the words slip out during their arguments. The burden, the mistake. Adam, now a boisterous 7-year-old, was their son, and their world revolved entirely around him. He had their smiles, their bright eyes, and a future they spoke of in glowing certain terms. "Adam's going to be a great man one day," my father would boom, ruffling his hair as if anointing a prince. "He can be anything he wants to be." And I was me, the paralyzed older brother tucked away in a corner like a piece of unwanted furniture. My only companions, the dog-eared paperbacks and the ghosts of dreams I'd given up on long ago. But this particular Thanksgiving was about to change everything. I could feel a strange energy in the air from the moment I woke up. My mother moved through the kitchen with a frantic, focused intensity, a whirlwind of activity as she prepared the turkey, pies, and a dozen other dishes whose rich scents drifted up the stairs. She was wearing a new wine-red dress and her hair was styled in perfect glossy waves. She looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine. My father, usually so gruff and distant, was bustling around, polishing silverware and making cheerful calls to relatives, his voice buzzing with an unusual excitement. It was as if he was preparing for the most significant day of his entire life. Adam, dressed in a miniature suit and tie, was the star of the show, zipping through the house and soaking up the adoration as our aunts and uncles arrived, pinching his cheeks and cooing, "You're the pride of this family, you really are." I stayed put in my room, trying to tune it all out. Retreating was a skill I had perfected over the years, my own form of self-preservation. But then there was a sharp rap on my door. It was my mother. Her voice, when it came, was coated in a syrupy sweetness that set my teeth on edge. "Leo, sweetheart, come down and join the party. It's a very special day." I just stared at the door, stunned. I couldn't remember the last time they had willingly invited me to be a part of any family gathering. My heart gave a stupid, hopeful little flutter. With a knot of nervous anticipation tightening in my gut, I wheeled myself out of my room and toward the living room. A foolish, desperate part of me dared to hope that maybe just this once I wouldn't be invisible. The room was bathed in the warm, glittering light of the crystal chandelier. The dining table was a vision from a magazine, set with a crisp white cloth, gleaming silverware, and platters piled high with steaming, delicious-smelling food. It was crowded with my parents' friends and distant relatives, people whose faces were vaguely familiar, their laughter and loud chatter filling the space. Adam was seated at the head of the table, wedged happily between my parents, looking like a miniature prince on his throne. I found an empty spot at the far end of the table and carefully positioned my chair, trying to make myself as small as possible. A few people shot me quick, uncomfortable smiles before their eyes darted away back to their conversations. I was used to being ignored, but something about my parents' behavior tonight put me on high alert. I saw them exchange a loaded look over Adam's head, a silent communication that was clearly not meant for me. The meal began. My father pushed his chair back and stood up, raising his wine glass. His voice, when he spoke, was smooth and confident. "Friends, family," he began, beaming at the crowd. "Thank you all for joining us on this momentous occasion. Thanksgiving is a time for gratitude," he continued, his chest puffed out. "And I have to say, Sarah and I are so very grateful for the wonderful life we've been able to build." The room broke into a wave of applause and a few scattered whoops. I kept my eyes fixed on my lap, my fingers twisting the linen napkin into a tight knot, trying to breathe past the familiar feeling of being an outsider looking in. Then my father's voice took on a more solemn tone. "But tonight is more than just a celebration. Tonight we want to announce a very important decision we've made. A decision that will secure the future of this family for generations to come." My head snapped up, my pulse hammered against my ribs. I saw my mother squeeze Adam's hand, her smile widening. My father's gaze swept across the table, his eyes gliding right past me as if I were a ghost at the feast. "We have decided," he announced, his voice ringing with authority, "that the entirety of the family's estate, this house, our investments, the businesses, everything will be passed down to our son, Adam, our pride and joy." The announcement was met with a fresh explosion of noise. Clapping cheers, voices calling out their approval. My aunts and uncles swarmed Adam, congratulating him, praising my parents for their foresight. Adam, basking in the attention, threw his arms around my mother's neck. She hugged him tight, whispering something in his ear that made him giggle with delight. And I just sat there. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The entire world seemed to have frozen around me. The estate, the house, their future. It was all for Adam. What was left for me? I wasn't asking for money. I never dreamed of inheriting their wealth. All I ever wanted deep down was to be seen, to be loved, to be treated like I was their son too. Was that too much to ask? I drew in a shaky breath, fighting to keep my voice from breaking. What about me? The words were quiet, but in the sudden lull, they sounded like a gunshot. The chatter died instantly. Every head in the room swiveled in my direction. My mother's smile froze on her face. Her hands tightened on Adam's shoulders. My father turned his head slowly, deliberately, and pinned me with a look of pure contempt. He let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound full of ridicule and disgust. "What about you, Leo?" he sneered, the words dripping with venom. "What exactly do you bring to the table? You are a weight we have carried for 18 long years. A burden." Each word was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. The room started to tilt and swim around me. I could hear the muffled whispers, the snickers from some of our relatives. My mother refused to look at me, her eyes fixed on her plate as if she was deeply embarrassed by my very existence. Adam just stared, his young face a mask of confusion, completely unaware of the public execution that was taking place. A hot, furious wave of shame and rage washed over me. I wanted to shout, to scream, to upend the whole damn table and make them look at me, but my body wouldn't move. My hands clamped down on the arms of my wheelchair, my knuckles turning white. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I forced them back, biting down so hard on my jaw that it ached. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. Not ever again. And just like that, the party resumed. The laughter and clinking glasses started up again, as if I had never spoken, as if I wasn't even there. No one noticed as I slowly, quietly, wheeled myself away from the table and out of the room. Back in the sanctuary of my bedroom, I shut the door, welcoming the sudden, heavy silence. The darkness felt like a blanket. The agony wasn't just from my father's cruel words. It was the crushing weight of 18 years of neglect, of being made to feel small and worthless, of being treated like a shameful secret. My eyes swept over the familiar objects, the narrow bed, the sagging bookshelf, the worn-out adventure novels that had been my only escape. All of it belonged to this house, a place where it was now terrifyingly clear I did not belong. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I just lay there, staring up at the dark ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of celebration floating up from downstairs. Each burst of laughter a fresh stab to my heart. My mind drifted back to the cramped apartment in the Hollows. We had nothing then, but when my parents looked at me, I saw love. I saw myself reflected in their eyes as their son. Then my thoughts turned to that cold, white room, the sting of the needles, the way my legs just stopped working. And then the sudden, inexplicable flood of money, the new house, the new life. I had always known on some deep instinctual level that the two things were connected, that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. I had just been too scared to look at it head on. But tonight, hearing my father call me a burden, hearing the finality in his voice, something inside me broke. The last fragile thread of hope I'd been clinging to finally snapped. I couldn't stay. I couldn't spend one more night in a house where my presence was a source of shame. I pushed myself up and switched on the small lamp on my desk. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely function, but I pulled my old backpack from the closet and started to pack. It didn't take long. I didn't own much that felt truly mine. A few changes of clothes. The books that had saved my life over and over again. After my parents and their guests had finally gone to bed, I crept into the kitchen, my wheels silent on the tile floor, moving like a burglar in the house I grew up in. I grabbed a water bottle from the fridge and a handful of granola bars from the pantry. I had no destination, no plan. All I had was the suffocating certainty that if I stayed, I would cease to exist. My body might keep breathing, but the part of me that mattered, my spirit, would finally be snuffed out for good. Just before sunrise, when the sky was a pale, bruised purple, I guided my chair to the back door. A small wooden ramp, built years ago as an afterthought and seldom used, was my only escape route. I paused at the top, looking back one last time at the big silent house, its windows dark. My family was inside, sleeping soundly, completely oblivious. I thought of Adam, so innocent in all of this. Would he ever know? Would he ever understand the truth of what they had done to me? I thought of my parents, the two people who were once the center of my universe, and felt nothing but a vast empty canyon where my love for them used to be. They were strangers to me now. With a final deep breath, I turned my back on that life and pushed myself down the ramp into the damp, foggy morning. My only possessions were the pain I carried and a spirit that felt broken beyond repair. I had no money. I had nowhere to go. There was only a single desperate word echoing in my mind. Survive. I pushed myself through the quiet suburban streets as the world slowly began to wake up around me. Lights flickered on in kitchens. The first cars pulled out of driveways. My arms screamed in protest, but I didn't slow down. I kept going until I reached the grittier streets of downtown Gary, where small groups of homeless people were huddled for warmth under the concrete overpasses. An old woman with a kind, wrinkled face and a coat held together with safety pins looked up as I approached. "You look lost, son," she said, her voice raspy. I shook my head, my throat so tight I could barely speak. "No," I managed to get out. I don't have a home anymore." She took me to a nearby support center for people with disabilities. They gave me a cot in a crowded room and a bowl of hot soup that I ate so fast I barely tasted it. That night, lying on the thin, hard mattress, listening to the symphony of snores and coughs from the strangers around me, I had no idea what tomorrow would bring. I had my backpack, a few dollars I'd scrounged, and a heart that felt like it had been ripped to shreds. But deep in the wreckage, a tiny flame flickered to life. It wasn't hope. It was pure, unadulterated rage. I needed answers. I needed to know why my own parents could throw me away like trash. I had to understand the connection between my paralysis, their sudden fortune, and why I had become the price they were willing to pay. In those first few days after I left, I thought I'd finally hit rock bottom. I truly believed things couldn't get any worse. But life, it seems, has a way of proving you wrong, just when you think you've seen it all. The shelter wasn't easy, but at least I could breathe there. Everyone, from the overworked, bone-tired social workers to the other residents, each one carrying their own invisible burdens, had a story. I quickly learned that you didn't pry. You just accepted people as they were. They gave me a small space in the communal dorm, a corner partitioned off by a flimsy curtain that offered the illusion of privacy. During the day, I'd escape to a nearby park. I'd find a quiet bench and read for hours, or just watch the endless stream of people hurrying by, trying to make sense of a world that felt so completely alien to me now. But no matter what I did, my thoughts always circled back to them. To Frank and Sarah, to that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner. "You're a burden." The words echoed in my head constantly, a poison I couldn't get out of my system. One afternoon, as I was wheeling back into the shelter, one of the case managers stopped me. Her name was Angela, a kind woman with tired eyes and a warm smile that never quite faded. "Leo," she said, holding out a plain white envelope. "This came for you." I stared at it, completely bewildered. How could anyone know I was here? I hadn't contacted a single soul. My parents, friends, and family certainly wouldn't be looking for me in a place like this. There was no return address, just my name. To Leo, written in a spidery blue script across the front. My heart started to pound as I took the letter from her. Back in my little corner, I pulled the curtain closed and switched on my reading light. My hands were trembling as I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of cheap notebook paper folded neatly in two. The message was scrawled in that same unsteady handwriting, as if the person who wrote it was terrified or in a great hurry. I unfolded it. The words leaped off the page and punched the air from my lungs. You were never sick. You were a victim. Your parents sold you. They used you as a human test subject. My son was one too. They work for an illegal drug company. They're brokers. Find the truth, Leo. There was no name, no contact information, just a series of short, brutal sentences that felt like they were carving themselves into my brain. I read it again and then a third time, the words blurring together. Sold you, test subject, illegal drug company. It was insane. It had to be a cruel prank. But as I sat there, the room spinning, a cold, quiet voice in the back of my mind spoke a truth I could no longer deny. You always knew. You always knew something wasn't right. I sat there for what felt like hours, my hand clenched so tightly around the letter that the paper became a crumpled, sweaty ball. A tidal wave of memories crashed over me, each one sharper and more vivid than ever before. The blindingly white room, the sting of the needles in my arm and neck, Dr. Peterson and his dead-eyed smile, the slow creeping numbness that stole my legs. And then, the money, the new car, the mansion, the hushed, urgent phone calls in the middle of the night, the way they looked at me with that mixture of guilt and resentment. All the pieces I had been too afraid to put together were now laid out before me, forming a picture of unimaginable horror. But still I resisted. A part of my mind screamed in denial. It couldn't be true. My parents, yes, they were cold, they were cruel, but they were still my parents. They had fed me. They had put a roof over my head, even if that roof covered a house where I was never truly welcome. Could they really be capable of something so monstrous? Could they really sell their own child? I shoved the letter deep into my pocket, a physical attempt to bury the thoughts it had unleashed. It had to be a mistake, a lie. Maybe it was from someone who was jealous of their success, trying to destroy them. It had to be. But the words wouldn't go away. They were branded onto my brain. That night, lying awake in the darkness of the dorm, the letter felt like it was burning a hole in my pocket. I thought about Adam, my happy, innocent little brother, being showered with the affection I had craved my whole life. I heard my father's voice dripping with contempt. What do you contribute? And then I thought about my legs, my useless dead legs, my life stolen from me for no reason I could ever understand. If that letter was telling the truth, if my parents were responsible, I had to know. At that point, it wasn't even about revenge. It was about something more fundamental. I needed to understand why. Why my life had been shattered into a million pieces. I deserved to know the truth. The next morning, my search began. I didn't have much to go on, but the letter was a start. I found Angela at the front desk and asked her about it. She just shook her head. Some guy dropped it off, she said, her brow furrowed in thought. He didn't give a name. Wore a baseball cap pulled down real low. I never really saw his face. A cold finger of dread traced its way down my spine. Whoever sent this didn't want to be found. Someone had gone to great lengths to find me, to deliver this cryptic message, and to remain anonymous. The thought was both intriguing and terrifying. I had to start somewhere. I took out a notebook and a pen from my backpack and began to write down everything I could force myself to remember from that day when I was 9. The sterile white room, Dr. Peterson. The icy shock of the metal table against my skin, the 2 sharp pricks of the needles. The details were foggy, shrouded in the haze of trauma and time, but I wrote them all down. I kept going. My parents' inexplicable fortune, the hushed, angry phone calls, and that file I'd found in my father's desk, the one with the words that now screamed at me from the page. Clinical trial, compensation. I still didn't fully grasp their meaning, but I knew they were important. They were the only clues I had, and I held onto them with the desperation of a man going under for the third time. I made a decision. I had to go back to the Hollows, back to where it all began. Maybe someone there, someone from my past, still remembered something. It was a long shot, but it was the only one I had. The support center offered free city bus passes to residents with disabilities, and I used one to make the trip. Returning to the Hollows felt like getting sucker punched. Nothing had changed. The same sagging porches, the same smell of rust and rot hanging in the air, the same weary, defeated expressions on the faces of the people on the street. It was like stepping back in time, into a past I had tried so hard to outrun. I wheeled myself down the cracked and broken sidewalks, my heart aching with a strange mix of nostalgia and dread. I passed the garage where my dad used to work, the air still thick with the scent of grease. I passed the empty lot where the tire mountain used to be, the place where Sam and I had planned our escape from the world. Sam, where was he now? Did he ever think about me? I finally reached the building where we used to live, our old apartment. Someone else was there now. I could see cheap blue curtains in the window and a small child's tricycle parked by the front steps. I sat there for a long time, just staring up at it, feeling like a ghost visiting the scene of a crime. It was like I could almost see him, the 9-year-old version of me, the kid who still had dreams before his world was torn apart. I don't know what I was hoping to find. Some kind of sign, maybe. An answer written in the peeling paint. But there was nothing. Just the heavy, oppressive silence of a place that time had forgotten. I started asking around, hoping to find someone who remembered us. Most of the old families were long gone, but I eventually found Mrs. Gable, an elderly woman who used to live in the apartment across the hall. She was sitting on her front stoop, her hands busy with a pair of knitting needles, her eyes milky with cataracts. When I told her who I was, she peered at me, her brow furrowed, and then a slow, sad smile spread across her face. Leo, little Leo, who was always climbing on those tires? Lord have mercy, look at you. I asked her about my parents, about what she remembered from back then. She let out a long, weary sigh, her eyes fixed on something far away. They were different after that day, she said, her voice a reedy whisper. The day they took you off somewhere. Your mama, she was crying her eyes out when they got back, but she never said a word about why. And then just like that, they had money, packed up and left in a hurry. We all thought it was mighty strange, but in a place like this, you learn not to ask questions. Mrs. Gable's words were like gasoline on the fire of my suspicion. I took a chance. I told her about the letter. I told her what it claimed my parents had done. Her hands stilled in her lap. She leaned forward, her eyes suddenly sharp and focused, and dropped her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Leo, listen to me. Around that same time, a few other children from this neighborhood just vanished. One day they were here, the next they were gone. Their families never said where they went. But there were whispers, rumors about some kind of clinic out on the interstate. People said it wasn't a real hospital, she continued, her voice barely audible. They said it was a place for other kinds of business. Do you remember the place they took you? My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might break through. I nodded. The White Room, I whispered. Dr. Peterson. I pressed her for more, but she shook her head, her face etched with fear. That's all I know, son, but you be careful. Powerful people, the kind who do business like that, they don't like it when you start digging up the past. I thanked her and wheeled myself away, my mind a chaotic storm of thoughts and emotions. The letter wasn't a sick joke, it was real. And if it was real, then my parents hadn't just abandoned me. They had actively, deliberately destroyed me. When I got back to the shelter, a new emotion had taken root inside me, something hard and cold and dangerous. Rage. It wasn't a hot, flashing anger, but a slow, steady burn like coals glowing in the dark. I pulled the letter out again. My son was one too. Who was this person? What had happened to their child? And why contact me now after all these years? I had no answers, but I had a purpose. I couldn't stop now. I had to see this through to the end, no matter how ugly the truth turned out to be. That night, I opened my notebook to a fresh page. Under the heading Next Steps, I wrote 2 things. Find Dr. Peterson. Find the clinic on the highway. It was a start. I had no idea where this path would take me, but one thing was certain. I was no longer the broken, terrified boy who had fled his home on Thanksgiving. That anonymous letter had ignited something inside me, a part of myself I thought had been extinguished forever. I would uncover the truth. I would make them answer for what they did, and I didn't care what it cost me. My search began with small, tentative steps, like a blind man feeling his way through a dark room. I had no resources, no powerful friends, nothing but the burning anger in my gut and a new, unfamiliar sense of resolve. The first logical step, I decided, was to find my medical records. I remembered my parents taking me to the county hospital in the Hollows back when my legs first started to fail. If there was any official documentation of my condition, it would be there. My hands were shaking as I dialed the hospital's records department. I explained what I needed, my voice cracking with nerves. The clerk on the other end was polite but firm. I'd have to come in person and present a valid photo ID. All I had was the state identification card my parents had grudgingly helped me get a few years earlier, but it would have to be enough. I tucked the ID into my backpack, grabbed another bus pass from the front desk at the shelter, and headed out. The Hollows County Hospital was just as old and run down as I remembered, the air thick with the smell of disinfectant, the walls streaked with grime. I navigated the long, dim hallways to the records office, where a woman with tired eyes sat typing behind a plexiglass window. I need to get copies of my medical records from 2009, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. She gave me a brief, sympathetic glance before asking for my ID. After a few minutes of clacking away at her keyboard, she disappeared into a back room and returned with a flimsy manila folder. "This is everything we have for you, Leo," she said, sliding it through the slot. "But it's not much." My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened it right there in the hallway. The file confirmed my diagnosis: unspecified neurological disorder, 9 years old, admitted for progressive loss of mobility in the lower extremities. But it was a small, handwritten note at the bottom of the page that made the blood run cold in my veins. No preliminary tests on file, no imaging, no detailed etiology report. Just a single faded line of ink. Patient transferred from private care facility. Attending physician Dr. Peterson. Dr. Peterson, the name from the White Room. His name was like a phantom, pulling me right back into that terrifying, sterile room. I asked the clerk if she knew a Dr. Peterson or anything about a private facility he might have worked at. She shook her head wearily. "Back then, little pop-up clinics came and went all the time," she said. "Nobody really regulated them. You could try the State Board of Health. They might have something." I thanked her, put the thin folder in my bag, and wheeled myself out of there, my head spinning. The records hadn't given me answers. They had only deepened the mystery. Why were there no test results? Why was Dr. Peterson the only doctor named? And why, after such a devastating diagnosis, had my parents never sought a second opinion or any kind of follow-up care? My next stop had to be the clinic, the one Mrs. Gable had whispered about, out on the interstate. I went back to the Hollows and started asking questions, wheeling from one block to the next. talking to anyone who looked old enough to remember that time. Most people just shrugged or offered up the same vague rumors I'd already heard. A secretive clinic, unmarked trucks coming and going at all hours, kids who just vanished. But then I found Mr. Henderson. He was a former neighbor who used to come over for beers with my dad when I was a kid. Now he was a stooped old man with a shock of white hair, nursing a cup of coffee in a booth at a local greasy spoon. "That clinic," Mr. Henderson said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Yeah, I remember it. It was a few miles north of here, right off Route 41, just a plain gray building, no name on it. Word was they did drug trials out there, but folks around here knew to stay away." His eyes, roomy but sharp, held mine. "Your folks took you out there once, didn't they, son?" I could only nod, my throat too tight to speak. "They were different after that," he went on, stirring his coffee. "All of a sudden, your dad, Frank, he had cash to burn. Bought that fancy new car, and then poof, they were gone." He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. I asked him once where the money came from. He just laughed and said he got lucky in business. But I knew better. Nobody gets rich that quick, not in the hollows. Mr. Henderson's words were like a punch to the gut. I asked if he'd ever heard the name Dr. Peterson. He shook his head. "Never heard the name, but I heard things about that place. Heard they didn't just use adults for their tests, they used kids. Poor kids from the neighborhood, orphans, kids nobody would miss." The coffee cup trembled in my hand. Kids nobody would miss. That was me, wasn't it? A poor kid from a forgotten neighborhood, an easy target, a disposable commodity. I had to find that clinic, the gray building Mr. Henderson described, out on Route 41. I didn't have a car or money for a cab, so I went back to the shelter and talked to Angela. She made a few calls and managed to arrange a ride for me through a local volunteer transport service. The drive took almost an hour, leaving the city behind for flat, empty farmland and two-lane country roads. When the volunteer driver finally pulled over, my breath caught in my throat. It was the place, the same bleak gray concrete box I remembered, windowless and foreboding. But now it was clearly deserted. Weeds choked the entrance. The heavy steel door was chained shut with a thick, rusty padlock. The place was a tomb. I had the driver help me out, and I wheeled myself closer, trying to peer through a grimy crack in one of the boarded-up windows. All I could see inside was darkness and the ghostly shapes of overturned furniture and scattered trash. Whatever this place had been, it was a hollowed-out shell now, its secrets sealed away. I sat there for a long time under the overcast sky, the silence pressing in on me. I had come all this way only to find another dead end. The clinic had been my only solid lead, and now it was gone. I felt a wave of despair wash over me. But then I thought of the letter, the words that had started this whole thing. "You were a victim. Your parents sold you." If the clinic was a dead end, there was only one other place the truth could be hiding. My parents' house. I remembered that file, those words. Clinical trial, compensation. The thought of going back there, of setting foot in that house where I had been so thoroughly rejected, made my stomach clench with anxiety. But I had to know. If the proof I needed was locked away in my father's desk, I had to get my hands on it. I spent the rest of the day gathering my nerve. I packed my notebook and ID into my backpack, and the next morning I took a series of buses that carried me from the gritty streets of the city to the manicured lawns of their wealthy suburb. Standing there on the sidewalk, staring at the perfect house with its pristine white fence, I felt like I was from another planet. This house, with its perfect green lawn and its warm, inviting windows, was a monument to my isolation. Every brick was a reminder of a family dinner I wasn't wanted at, a conversation I was excluded from, a life I was never allowed to be a part of. I took a deep breath and knocked. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. After a moment, the door opened. It was my mother. Her eyes widened in shock and then immediately hardened into a look of pure annoyance. "Leo," she said, her voice tight with displeasure, "what are you doing here?" Before I could even form a response, my father appeared in the doorway behind her, his face a thundercloud. He looked just as he had on Thanksgiving night, cold, dismissive, and angry. "What do you want?" he snapped, his voice like a whip. "I thought we made ourselves perfectly clear. The whole point of that night was to make you understand that you are not a part of this family's future. You left. We were relieved. Why in God's name are you back?" His words were meant to wound, and they did. A hot, furious retort rose in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I had to stay calm. I had to get inside. "I just came back for a few things," I said, forcing my voice to remain level. "Some old stuff I left behind. I'll just be a day or two, and then I'll be out of your hair for good." I saw my mother shoot a quick, uncertain glance at my father. I could see them weighing their options, probably debating whether they could get away with just slamming the door in my face. Finally, with a put-upon sigh, she stepped aside. "Fine," she said, "but you stay out of our way. No trouble." They didn't ask where I'd been. They didn't ask if I was okay, if I had a place to sleep, if I'd had anything to eat. Their utter lack of curiosity was more damning than any insult they could have hurled at me. It confirmed what I already knew. They did not care. They had never cared. I wheeled myself down the familiar, spacious hallways, but the house no longer felt like home. It felt like a museum, cold and impersonal. Adam was at school, so the only sounds were the low murmur of the television from the living room and my mother's quiet movements in the kitchen. They let me use my old room, which was exactly as I had left it, a time capsule of my lonely childhood. But I wasn't there to reminisce. I was on a mission. That night I waited. I lay in my bed listening until the house fell silent and the only light came from the street lamps outside. Then I moved. I guided my chair out of my room and down the hall to my father's study. When I was a kid, that door was always locked. Tonight it was open. I guess they never thought I'd be back. I slipped inside, closing the door softly behind me. Using the dim glow of the desk lamp, I started my search. I went through every drawer, sifting through stacks of bills, investment statements, and business contracts. Nothing. I checked the shelves behind the books, even in the wastebasket, still nothing. By the second night, I was starting to lose hope, thinking maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But on the third night, my parents went out to a dinner party, leaving me alone in the house. I went back to the study for one last look. This time, I focused on the bottom drawer of the desk, the one my father had always forbidden me from touching. It was locked. But my desperation gave me an idea. I ran my hands under the edge of the thick Persian rug and my fingers brushed against cold metal. A tiny key. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely fit the key in the lock, but it turned. I pulled the drawer open, and there it was, a thick, worn folder held together by a brittle rubber band. On the tab, 2 words were typed in bold letters: Medvance Contract, 2009. I pulled it out, my heart hammering in my chest. I flipped it open. The first things I saw were bank statements, records of wire transfers from an entity called Medvance Pharmaceuticals into my parents' personal account. The sums were staggering, tens of thousands of dollars. The memo line on each transfer was the same: brokerage services. Then I saw another document, a participant list. It was a column of initials, and there, near the top, was the letter L, followed by a note: clinical trial subject L Mo. Subject L. That was me. I knew it. A wave of nausea washed over me as I kept reading. There were other initials, and next to them, horrifying notes: severe neurological damage, liver failure, deceased. And then I saw it, a separate sheet of paper, a handwritten memo in my father's familiar scrawl. Subject L. Successful. Paralysis achieved with minimal complications. Recommend proceeding with expanded cooperation. I just sat there in the quiet dark of the study, the papers trembling in my hands, hot tears finally spilling over and streaming down my face. It was so much worse than I had ever imagined. They hadn't just sold me, they had used me. I was their pilot program, their proof of concept. My broken body was the foundation upon which they built their horrific business, trafficking vulnerable children to medvants for their deadly experiments. I was the commodity that bought them their perfect life. I took pictures of every single page with my phone. Then I put the folder back exactly where I found it, locked the drawer, and hid the key. The next morning I was gone before they even woke up. I didn't say goodbye, there was nothing left to say. They had stolen my future. Now I was going to take back the truth. Back in my small curtained-off corner at the shelter, I clutched the evidence I had risked everything to get. The contracts, the bank statements, the list of victims. It was all there. Undeniable proof that my parents, Frank and Sarah, were monsters. That list of 17 names, each one followed by a cold clinical summary of their fate, severe neurological damage, deceased, was seared into my memory. These weren't just names on a page, they were stolen lives. I couldn't let my parents or the corporation they worked for get away with this, but I knew I couldn't do it alone. To take on a company like Medvance, I needed help. I needed the other victims. I started with the initials from the list. It was a painstaking process of searching public records, cross-referencing old news articles, sending messages on social media, making dozens of phone calls. Many people never responded, but some did. I found Maria, the mother of a boy named Daniel. Just like me, Daniel had been taken for a special checkup in 2009. Just like me, he never walked again. Maria told me, her voice thick with unshed tears, that it was my mother, Sarah, who had convinced her to sign the consent forms for what she thought was a free preventative health program. She had such a kind smile, Maria choked out. She seemed so trustworthy. I shared the documents I'd found with her. Seeing the proof in black and white, she agreed to join me. I didn't stop there. I kept digging, and one by one I found them. 7 other victims and their families. There was Chloe, a young woman now tethered to a ventilator just to breathe. There was Mark, whose younger brother died just weeks after one of the checkups. Each one of them carried a deep, unhealable wound inflicted by Medvance. Each one of them wanted justice. We started meeting in secret, a small, determined group in the dusty basement of a community center. We called ourselves the Forgotten. As we sat in a circle sharing our stories, a powerful sense of solidarity began to form. The weight of what we were doing was immense, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. With the group's blessing, I reached out to a human rights attorney named Rebecca Shaw. I sent her a carefully worded email, and she agreed to meet with me. I laid out all the documents on the polished wood of her conference table and told her everything. She listened without interruption, her expression growing more and more grim. "This is huge, Leo," she said when I had finished, her eyes locking with mine. "But it's also incredibly dangerous. A company like this will fight back hard. Are you prepared for that?" I thought of the 17 names. I thought of Chloe on her ventilator and Mark's little brother in his grave. "Yes," I said, my voice firm. "I am." That March, Rebecca filed a class action lawsuit in federal court. We named Medvance Pharmaceuticals as the primary defendant, and my parents, Frank and Sarah, as co-conspirators. The story blew up. The media descended like vultures. Headlines screamed, "Son sues parents in massive medical scandal." Some people hailed me as a hero, Others called me a monster, a traitor to my own family. I ignored it all. I had the truth on my side. I had the other victims, and I had the evidence. The war had begun. The trial started on a dreary, rain-soaked morning in June, 3 months to the day after we filed the suit. I wheeled myself into the imposing wood-paneled federal courtroom in Gary, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The room was packed, spectators, reporters, and in the rows directly behind me, the families of the other victims. Rebecca stood at my side, a calm, reassuring presence. Across the aisle sat Med Vance's army of high-priced lawyers, all tailored suits and confident smirks, and next to them my parents. Frank and Sarah sat stiffly, their faces pale, their eyes fixed firmly on the judge's bench, refusing to look at me. I never thought I would see them again like this across a courtroom as my adversaries. They were the people who had created me, and they were the people who had destroyed me. Rebecca began her opening statement, her voice clear and strong, methodically laying out our case. She presented the documents from my father's study, the wire transfers, the list of victims. She called our first witnesses, Maria, Chloe, Mark, and then me. She painted a damning picture of a ruthless corporation preying on the vulnerable, and of my parents who acted as their willing accomplices, their brokers, luring desperate families into a nightmare with false hope and dirty money. When it was their turn, my parents' lawyer claimed it was all a fabrication. My father took the stand, his voice shaking with feigned indignation. "Leo is a troubled, vindictive young man," he declared, his voice ringing with false conviction. "He is consumed by jealousy of his younger brother, Adam. This entire story is a fantasy, a pathetic attempt to destroy the family he feels rejected him." His words were a direct echo of that night, the night he called me a burden, and they hit me with the force of a physical blow. Beside him, my mother stared at her hands, her whole body trembling. Their lawyers painted me as a liar, an opportunist out for revenge. Med Vance's legal team argued that our case was baseless, a cynical shakedown, and moved for an immediate dismissal. But Rebecca was unshakable. She calmly presented the bank records, the wire transfers from Med Vance to my parents, the ones marked brokerage services. She pointed to the line item for trial subject Ellie. "That," she said, her voice ringing through the silent courtroom, "is Leo." She put Maria on the stand, who tearfully recounted how my mother had personally recruited her. Then it was Chloe's turn. Frail and struggling for every breath, she spoke through a special device fitted to her ventilator. "They never asked me," she whispered, her voice amplified by the microphone. They gave me a shot, and now this is my life." Mark testified about his brother, about how he went for a simple checkup and died a month later. With every witness, the foundation of my parents' lies began to crumble. Finally, it was my turn. As I wheeled myself to the witness stand, I could feel my parents' eyes on me, a heavy, suffocating weight. I told the jury everything. I took them back to that day when I was 9, to the White Room and Dr. Peterson and the needles. I described losing the feeling in my legs and the sudden, inexplicable fortune that followed. "They told me I was a burden," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "But they are the real burden. They are a burden on me, on Daniel, on Chloe, on every single life they shattered for money." The courtroom was utterly silent. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my mother finally break, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. But my father just stared at me, his face a mask of pure, undiluted hatred. On cross-examination, Med Vance's lawyers tried to tear me apart. They brought up my family history, suggesting my testimony was the product of a troubled mind, warped by years of perceived rejection. But Rebecca was ready for them. She produced her trump card, a series of internal Med Vance emails leaked by an anonymous whistleblower. The emails proved beyond any doubt that the company's executives knew their experimental drug was causing catastrophic neurological damage, but they had ordered the trials to continue, burying the data to protect their profits. The evidence was undeniable. After 3 long, grueling weeks, the jury was ready. I'll never forget that day. The sun was shining outside, but inside the courtroom, the air was so thick with tension you could barely breathe. The judge, a formidable man with eyes that missed nothing, stood to read the verdict. Frank and Sarah were found guilty on all counts: human trafficking, aggravated child abuse, and conspiracy to conduct illegal medical experiments. The judge sentenced them to 40 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of parole. Their assets, the house, the cars, the investments, everything were seized by the court to be liquidated and distributed as restitution to the victims. As the first victim and the one who brought the case to light, I was awarded $1.2 million. Medvance was hit with a fine so massive it effectively bankrupted them, and several of their top executives were immediately taken into custody to face their own criminal charges. I heard the words, but I didn't feel the victory. There was no joy, no sense of triumph, just a profound, hollow emptiness. I watched as the bailiffs put my parents in handcuffs. As they were led away, my mother turned and looked at me, her face streaked with tears. "Leo," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I am so sorry." But it was 20 years too late. I just turned my chair and wheeled myself out of the courtroom, my heart feeling as heavy as a stone. It's been more than 10 years now since that day in court. I'm still Leo, still in this wheelchair. I still come to this care facility in Indiana every week. The rain is still falling outside my window, but I'm not here to hide from the world anymore. I'm here because I have a story to tell. It's a story about unimaginable loss and betrayal, yes, but it's also about fighting back. It's about hope. A decade ago, I faced down the 2 people who gave me life, Frank and Sarah, and exposed them for who they really were. Monsters who sold their own child to a corrupt pharmaceutical company called Medvance in exchange for a life of luxury. They took my ability to walk. They stole my childhood, but they couldn't take my voice. I fought for the truth. I found the other survivors, people like Daniel and Chloe, and together we dragged the darkness into the light. We won, not just a legal victory, but a victory for our own humanity. Today, I'm sitting in a circle with a support group. There's a young girl here who lost her leg in a car crash. There's an old man whose hands won't stop shaking from Parkinson's. And I'm telling them my story. I tell them about the white room and the needles. I tell them about that Thanksgiving dinner and the moment my father called me a burden. I tell them about the anonymous letter that changed everything, and the long, difficult road to justice. When I'm done, the young girl looks at me, her eyes shining, and she whispers, "If you could get through all that, then maybe I can too." And I smile, not because I think I'm some kind of hero, but because in their faces I see a reflection of my own journey. We are all just survivors, doing the best we can, refusing to give up. I used the money from the settlement to start an organization. It's called The Forgotten. We provide legal aid, counseling, and support for other victims of illegal medical testing. We give them a safe place to land, and more than anything, we listen. But the real reason I tell my story, the reason I'm telling it to you now, is to share the one thing I know for sure. You are not a burden. It doesn't matter how many times you get knocked down, or how betrayed you feel, or even if the people who are supposed to love you most are the ones who hurt you. There is a strength inside you that you can't even imagine. The strength to stand up in your own way and fight back. I lost the use of my legs, but in that loss I found my voice. And if a broken kid from the hollows can do that, then I promise you so can you. So live your life. Speak your truth, and never ever let anyone make you feel like you don't deserve to be heard.